Well, hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the very first episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. My name is Matthew, I'm your host. Really excited to be kicking this podcast off. Two logistical things that I want to get out of the way before we get into the meat of this very first episode. Number one, setting a vision for this podcast. So in general, my hope for this podcast is that it's a forum for young adult Catholics and Christians for that matter to come together in conversation on topics of morality, theology, faith formation, etc. Everyone comes from really different backgrounds and has different paths that God has led them down. And so by having conversations about faith formation, I find that we're strengthened even more because you get sort of the greatest hits from each person's perspective. Like, I read this book and I really got this out of it. And it's like, wow, I never really thought about it that way. And as it says in Proverbs 27:17, this is a favorite verse of some friends of mine and I. As iron sharpens iron, so one man or woman sharpens another. So that's the primary purpose of this podcast. Now, logistical topic number two, I'm deliberately leaving the purpose, full transparency of this podcast, a little more high level in general, because for some of you who might have worked in music or content creation or something along those lines, I have a tendency to create projects or albums or pieces of art or what have you without really considering whether or not there's an audience for it, without considering whether what I'm making is truly a value add for somebody out there. Now, what I would very much like to do with this is make it something that this community here in Nashville, we have a blossoming young adult Catholic community and a Christian community for that matter as well. And I really would love for this to be a forum that is useful for our listeners. And so to you as the listener, I want to extend a quick invitation. Send me ideas. I really want to know what it is you're interested in, what's top of mind for you these days. I know it's May of 2022, for example, and so you might write in and say, Matt, the Supreme Court just drafted a proposal to overturn Roe v. Wade. Can you do something on that? And yeah, that would be awesome. I would love to do a podcast on that if there's interest. I obviously have topics of my own that I'd love to get into, but I'd really love to create content that you're interested in. So topics are one thing, but also guests as well. Like, you may not necessarily have an idea for a podcast, but you might be able to say, hey, have you talked to Susan, or have you talked to Larry? Why am I giving you names from like the 1960s? Sorry. Have you talked to Michael, or have you talked to Rachel? Somebody like that. I really think that they would be great on your podcast, and you can volunteer yourself as well. If you're passionate about something and you feel confident about having a conversation with it and would want to be on the podcast, that honestly is like the perfect storm. I would love to have you on the podcast. That sounds awesome. And so, to send those ideas my way, long way around the block, best way to do that is to, if you're part of the Catholic community here in Nashville, hop in our GroupMe and send me a direct message. If you're a close friend or a family member, hi mom, you can send me a text message or an email personally. And then if we're not as close, hi, nice to meet you. You can send me a suggestion to the Fraternus Forge email address. That's fraternusforge@gmail.com. You'll look at the name of the podcast. There's no funky punctuation, no capitalization, nothing like that. It's just fraternusforge@gmail.com. Send me those ideas. I would love to hear from you. Okay, enough logistical talk. Thanks for listening to that. Let's get into the meat of this episode. So our very first guest on the podcast is a close friend in town, Hudson Martin. Hudson is the director of evangelization for our Nashville chapter of the Young Catholic Professionals organization. He's just been a really good friend. I'm always really impressed by how big his heart is and just his knowledge of the catechism. And in general, like, he's just got a really great laugh, and he uses it all the time when we hang out together. He makes me feel like Dave Chappelle, so really good friend. Happy to have him on the podcast. A little bit of background on this podcast itself. It initially wasn't supposed to be a podcast episode. Hudson and I drove down to visit the Medlins. Shout out to Alec and Scott and Alana and their parents in the Las Casas area, which is southeast of Nashville. We went to visit them on Easter Sunday, and I just said to Hudson on the way down, hey, I have this podcast thing I'm thinking of doing. Would you help me test out the equipment? And Hudson was like, yeah, of course. So we clipped on our microphones, started driving, and about 5 or 10 minutes, after 5 or 10 minutes of just kind of joking around and shooting the breeze, we actually got into some really, really good conversation about like faith formation and different phases that we go through as we're growing closer to Jesus, growing closer to Mary. And Hudson gives some really, really beautiful metaphors and frameworks for thinking about this in this episode, and I was kind of blown away by it. So really, really excited for you to hear that. Also, if you stick around to the end of the episode, you may or may not hear Hudson and I impersonate a well-known Disney character and then a well-known conservative commentator towards the end of this episode. So make sure you stick around until the end. Incentive, driving engagement. Here we go. Yeah, that's it for now. Let's jump into the episode. Thanks for listening.
Here's a hot take. You ready for a hot take?
Ready for a hot take.
And this is accusing myself.
Okay.
Stop listening to podcasts to form your theological opinions. Unless it's like, Father Gregory Pine, in which case, keep listening to Father Gregory Pine.
Yeah, he's a beast. He's so smart.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, though. Like, Catholics have ventured into the social media space, the digital space, and I think it's good. Father Mike Schmitz with Ascension Presents, they do fine work.
Yep.
The Word on Fire, they do great things.
Bishop Barron's been doing a bunch of stuff.
Well, he's with Word on Fire.
Oh, sick.
The Augustine Institute, of course, but I think there's a proper space that needs to be reserved for formal formation of just go grab Augustine, go grab the rest of the church fathers, go grab Aquinas, go grab St. Francis de Sales. This day and age, go grab Thomas Dubay when you're focusing on your interior life.
What I agree with you directionally speaking. What makes you say that? Because I think I have some opinions on that, but I want to hear.
Sure. So in 2018, I was a senior in college.
Okay.
And I found myself listening to this guy who has some hot takes.
Okay.
And is in a certain wing of the church, and I just found myself becoming bitter. And that's not a good spiritual space to be in.
Okay.
Instead of diving into the book that my spiritual director at the time had given me to read. And it's instead of being formed by sound bites, let a saint speak to you. Sound bites are fast, they're easy. It's drive-by correction. And St. Francis de Sales says, speed kills devotion. So,
okay,
it's kind of my opinion. It's nice because we're so inundated with so much content in the secular sphere, and so you want to be up to date on things, but you don't want to put trash into your mind. And so I can see where it's okay, I want to be. I'm not a hermit, I can't. So I want to be stimulated with things. And it's yeah, I understand that. And so you want to go to these, but I don't know.
It's not a substitute for faith formation.
No.
It can never take the place of that. It's a good icing on the cake. It's cool that we're in these spaces, but just because I listen to even an hour-long podcast with someone as smart as Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron, I know he's been on JP's podcast a couple of times. That doesn't mean I'm growing in my faith. And another thing too is that the further it gets from the source being the Gospels, Vatican Council documentation, Lives of the Saints, the further it gets from those sources, and the Catechism too.
Sure.
The more diluted it gets.
That's good. Yeah.
So you do want to go to the source. Now the source is complex sometimes. I have a really hard time reading St. Augustine and guys like G.K. Chesterton.
Yep.
Who are especially revered in the Catholic tradition, but I feel God honors that effort. When we put sweat and we take effort,
yeah,
even though we don't feel it, See, and like that's another thing too, and I'll just touch on this real quick. We have a mutual friend, Tim, who said this to me like we just wrapped up Exodus 90, and something Tim said to me that has stuck is, don't confuse the act of like prayer or studying scripture or like faith formation with the fruit that you want to get from that act. So like worship is like adoring God, and there's a movement in Protestantism where like the music is beautiful, and
Sure.
I sometimes judge myself and like the quality of my prayer, the quality of my worship based on how I feel emotionally. Like, oh wow, that was such a great service. I felt like all of these emotions going, but the end goal is not those emotions. The end goal is the surrender of the will. And sometimes it sucks. Sometimes it's like super dry, but I think God honors that.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting you say that, and reminds me. I was in confession. This was 2020. It was just before our friends Daniel and Angel got married. It had been a month, I guess, since my last confession, and I knew that I hadn't, like, I know I wasn't in a state of mortal sin, but I knew that, but I knew I had sinned, and I needed to be reconciled to God. But like for whatever reason, there was no, like, in prior years, there would be times when I was like, oh, I can feel the nastiness of my soul right now. There's just like all this soot on top of me. And I can just feel it. And I went to confession, and after I told him, like, I know I've offended God in certain ways. I can't exactly articulate how in this current state, because more or less I couldn't feel exactly what it was. And he was just telling me, like, this is actually a step up the ladder in the spiritual life. It's amazing how little your feelings actually matter.
He said that? Like, it's amazing how little.
No,
your feelings
I've heard
matter?
that in other circles too.
Oh, I see.
But
I gotcha.
His counsel, and then I'll take it from there. Was like, you know, you offended God, and while it's not necessarily like you can't really feel it, you have ascended to this spiritual conviction. So break that apart. Listening to Peter Kraft, while earlier I was condemning people listening to podcasts, he said, like, the saints will say how little your feelings actually matter in the moment. And I've also listened to um, trusted folks in one-on-one conversations, older folks who you know just simply stated feelings are not facts. Yeah. So like to that point, Mother Teresa, now Saint Teresa of Calcutta, she didn't feel anything for 50 years.
I have heard about that.
Yeah,
Like,
she didn't feel anything for 50 years and was in spiritual desolation. And to your point earlier about the Lord rewards her effort, like she drugged 25,000 people off the streets of Calcutta and converted 15,000 of them. And while she didn't feel any consolation after, say, one soul or another was converted, or one more person was saved from homelessness or whatever physical poverty they were in, like, she's now revered as one of our greatest.
Yeah, like, because I had heard that she went through that long period of desolation, and yet she still aligned herself to God's will. Like, these are daughters and sons of God. It's my mission to minister to them. We're good. Yeah. So for context, we're in the car right now, and
Johnny Law.
Johnny Law just passed by on the other side, and I was doing a little too fast, but I think we're good. I think he's got more important things to do. But yeah, like these are the people that the Lord has placed in front of me to serve. I'm going to serve them, regardless of like how it feels
in the moment.
Yeah, because how I feel in the moment is way less important than doing God's will.
Yeah. Absolutely. To our 2 listeners out there, speaking to ourselves, neither Matthew nor myself have any formal theological education.
Yeah, that's a helpful context as well.
So please do not
Yeah,
subject ourselves to that of a doctorate in theology.
right. Yeah, and that I think is some helpful context too, Hudson. Like, I don't have a degree in this stuff. Like, you don't have a degree in this stuff. This is like,
Bouncing ideas off.
yeah. Like, this is meant to be like, I don't know. I feel like it's a reflection of how folks in our age group, because like I turned 31 this year, and you're 26 this
Yes,
year.
sir.
Yeah. So
I am.
like, I think it's a reflection of how conversations between like folks in our age group can go. Like, these are sort of like the things that are being thrown around. These are the questions folks are asking, and I don't know. I feel like there's a relatability in that. At least I
Sure.
hope there is.
So, circling back,
Yeah.
when we talked about the feelings and the like, and we talked about, if dryness, I guess, would be, in the emotional station and how that actually can be more important.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned St. Francis de Sales earlier.
Yeah.
And in his book, Introduction to the Devout Life,
Yes.
he talked about, and many a saint has written upon this, there's 3 stages in the spiritual life. And they're not all like sequential. You can go from one stage back to another, and then, like it ebbs and flows. But the 3 stages are like the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way.
Okay.
And the purgative way is like, you're learning more about God, and you're purging away some of these past sins, but you're kind of teeter-tottering. Which way am I going to choose?
Mm-hmm.
The illuminative way is when you're experiencing like some serious consolations in prayer, and you're leaving your old life behind, and the currents of grace are just taking your ship out into the deep, And then in that unitive stage, the sea has left, and you are a ship in the middle of the Sahara Desert in the dead of winter.
Ooh.
And that's what Mother Teresa was for 50 years. The currents of grace, that sea of everlasting life, it's not even on the horizon anymore. It's just the dune sea around you, and it's cold, and it's dark.
That is a really useful framework. I have so many questions about this.
Sure.
We'll start with so there's the purgative state, which you sort of described as being like, so we've got purgative, illuminative, and unitive. Is that right?
Yeah.
So purgative is first, and
Yep.
in that stage, you're sort of shedding off old sins, learning more about God, and you said something in there that I want to double click on. Like, you're sort of teeter-tottering which way you're going to go.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Say more about that.
Sure. So I'll speak. So it's not so much theoretical as we'll make it personal. I like to be vulnerable.
Same.
So in college, I had a big conversion, of which I think we've discussed. And, I was in a fraternity, and living that life, where it was about drinking, it was skipping class, it was hooking up with women, you know, and then some pretty incredible things happened in my life. And that sophomore year, when I was learning more about the faith, I was teeter-tottering between this life I knew as a Southern frat boy and a life of grace. And I use the phrase teeter-totter because a missionary who changed my life, Pat, we having dinner. And I would come to him with these things I was struggling with. I would be very frank with him and say, hey, Pat, I went out and I went home with somebody tonight or the previous night, whatever it was. Or I said, Pat, I smoked weed earlier this week. Pat, I got trash this week. Like, and he had the gift of being frank and admonishing a sinner, but he also has that gift that few who call sinners out have, which is to continue walking with you. But he recognized we were at a pivotal stage, as this was probably 6 or 7 months after that like initial moment of grace where things had begun to change. And he said, Hudson, I can only tilt with you for so long. You got to make a choice which way you're going to go. So very much in that purgative stage, kind of in the early stages of the purgative, where like I knew what was wrong, but I wasn't resolute in my conviction to change.
Like releasing those things.
Releasing, absolutely, absolutely. And so that's sophomore year. Summer, the purgative is trending towards the illuminative because I started reading about St. Augustine and imploring his help for freedom from lust. And you just spoke about Exodus. In the fall of 2017, I did Exodus, and that's when we turned towards the illuminative. I essentially left my fraternity, garnered new friendships, holy friendships, and I started going to adoration, spending time in the chapel, and like all these constellations were coming in. That's when we're like getting into the illuminative stage.
Real quick, this is awesome. This is like so well put. Can you say a word or two about constellations? Like, what is a constellation?
Sure.
How does it feel when it comes? Like
sure.
How would you describe it?
Well, I'm positive there's a formal theological definition.
Okay.
In my mind,
because we're being very formal right here. Let's be as formal as possible, please.
Yeah. In my mind, it's a gentle hug from Jesus. But here's the thing. Sometimes those gentle hugs from Jesus are the weight of the cross being thrust upon you even more heavily. So, but that's another rabbit hole we can go down at another time perhaps. But consolation, it's just like
a nearness, maybe
a nearness to the Lord.
Okay.
A nearness to the Lord. You know you're with Him. You know not intellectually, and not you hear Jesus loved me, yes and no, for the Bible tells me. It's not that. It's integrated love.
Okay.
It is. It's. I liken it to. So you ever taken a sip of cold water, and when you swallow it, and then it's this odd thing where it hits your chest, and it
kind of just spider branches
it's
out.
Spider brains. Yeah, and you feel it throughout your body.
I said branches, you said spider brains. We both were aiming for spider webs. I don't know what a spider branch is. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah, but it just webs. And it's like all encompassing, and you feel refreshed. So a constellation is like, it's like just this spiritual refreshment. Where you feel yoked together.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And I wonder, and those, so sort of tying back to our tangent earlier about not chasing a feeling in prayer or the spiritual life. I imagine, because I think I've had what you're describing, like those consolations, and I do experience that as a feeling, as a pretty strong and joyful feeling, I would say. But we should not aim our study of Scripture, aim our spiritual formation or practice at receiving consolations.
No.
Those are the Lord's to give.
They are.
If and when He wants to.
They are, because, well, A, they'll go away. The constellations will go away. You will not live your life in a state of pure spiritual ecstasy.
Mm-hmm.
And you are not to fall in love with the constellations. We are to fall in love with the one who gives the constellations.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, great.
Agree.
I actually, I had like a similar experience to you, in terms of, and I want to make sure that we leave enough time here at the end to talk about the last stage,
Sure.
the unitive stage. But I'll say briefly that I had a similar experience to you in college where, yeah, like I'd say first 3 semesters I was very much like walking the way the world teaches us to walk. Um, I abused alcohol to the point of like not remembering what I did almost 5 nights a week.
Mm.
I smoked weed. I was promiscuous. All of those things, and I suffered. And I kind of just hit this point, and I don't know that like it was God that called me back explicitly, um, but I did find some solace in the church. Um, I think that when we sort of take it upon ourselves to like determine what is right and what is good, and when we ignore God, then God's not part of the picture, and the world that we're living in just seems so meaningless. You mean life is like these temporary little blips of woohoo that I feel every now and again, and the rest of it is just like suffering until I get back to one of those points, and then we just die, and that's it. Like, that's a horrible place to be. But I remember hitting like a real low point after like a couple of really rough nights, and I think I talked to maybe 1 or 2 priests in confession, but I just decided, yeah, I'm going to start going to mass again. And I remember walking across campus at like 7:30 on a Sunday to get there for 8 a.m. mass, and like the place is just like a ghost town from the night before, and there was like a peace in that. Like I was like, I think walking into those experiences, I was expecting to feel like this is going to be awful. Like I'm going to be so alone. Everyone's going to think I'm an idiot, and like I got a fair amount of flack from people in my fraternity. Like, what are you doing? You used to party with us all the time. Where are you going? But like, there was a peace in that. Like, in those walks on Sunday morning, I was just like, there's something here. There's something to this. So, I know that's kind of abstract and
No, it's great.
just likening to what you were saying.
Get 10 points if you get this wrong.
We missed him. Hey, all of God's creatures have a place right next to the potatoes and gravy.
Squirrels, potatoes, and gravy. That's the title of this episode.
So, let's talk unitive, that last stage.
Yeah.
And like you described it in a really good way, being like you were on the ocean of grace, and grace is like flowing through you and taking you to like new spiritual directions, giving you like a way where there appears to be no way, but then the ocean disappears and you're like left in the middle of the desert, and it's cold and it's blank on the horizon for as far as the eye can see. It's dark. I feel like God puts us in those seasons to like grow our trust in Him, or allows those seasons. Is that
absolutely? Yeah. And you know, Bishop Barron describes it really well. So like on a particular, like let's talk about an actual. Well, first off, another way of describing the unitive way is like those moments in your life where I think John of the Cross calls it the dark night of the soul, the midnight of the soul. Like, so
I really want to read that.
So let's think about a dark night. There is no moon. You know, we'll say it's a clear night, but nonetheless, it's dark.
I'm trying so hard to not make a Batman reference right now.
I know.
Go on. It's a dark night, no moon.
It's a dark night. There's no moon. Hey, look, she. Um, and you look up, and then you kind of realize there's more stars here than you could have possibly imagined that you wouldn't have been able to see unless the moon was moved. So too, we experience those seasons in our spiritual lives where all constellations are removed. You go to confession, and you let's say you're not living in a state of serious sin, of mortal sin, but you're still going to confession. But you remember those times when you would go to confession, you would leave, and you'd be so elated, you know. But now you're going to confession, and you're dry. You're as dry as a bone. You are sawdust, you know. Or you just left an hour of adoration with praise and worship music, and a year ago I was delighted. I was floating on clouds. Now it's Monday night at 8:30. I guess I got to get up for work tomorrow. You know, it's like there is nothing going on. I feel nothing. I mean, I am in a dark place. You know,
God feels distant.
God is he's. Sometimes it can get to the point where you're agnostic, or atheistic in a certain sense. It's like, does he even exist? Does he hear my cry? I mean, it's Psalm 22. We just, it's Easter. 3 days ago was Good Friday, and our Lord prays from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That's a spiritually dark place. I mean,
and like even like the fact that even Christ hit that point.
Sure.
Like he is God, and yet fully man at the same time. It's cool to see like the way that Christ's sufferings parallel our own. I'm just like making an observation there.
That's why the incarnation is so important. Like, it almost, I mean, it's a source. It's a source of, well, it's a cornerstone. Like, it's something you can place a firm foothold in. And that, like, there is nothing we will go through in this life that we can't identify with our crucified Lord in. So, like, let's bring it vulnerable again. There was a time in my life when I almost committed suicide. That's a dark night of the soul, you know? And, well, no, like, there's not points in Scripture when our Lord almost killed himself. True. But, like, that dark night of the soul when he's walking the road to Calvary and everyone around him is spitting on him and throwing rocks at him, he's whipped. I think The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson depicts it beautifully and accurately.
I agree. I was like kind of bummed to see all of the reviews that came out. And I mean, it's Hollywood, so they're gonna say what they're gonna say to like put down the church or anything related to the church.
Sure.
People called it like a 2-hour snuff film, and I was like, that's not.
I don't even know what that means.
Like, a snuff film is essentially like it's a torture film essentially, like, because some people want to see that. Like, it's kind of like Saw. It's kind of like they nicknamed it like the Jesus Christ Chainsaw Massacre, like just because of how. But that's really how it was. Like I
think it was probably worse.
Yeah, like the fact that they give Jesus like clothes when he's actually on the cross is like
that's for us.
That's for us. Yeah, 100%. And like when I look at stained glass renditions, because I did stations over at Holy Rosary on Good Friday, and they handed these pamphlets, and they had like a little stained glass rendition, and of each one of the stations, and in each one of those, the soldiers look so docile, and Jesus looks so docile. Like, he's just like, "What's up? You know, here's my cross. Oh no, I fell." Like, and it doesn't drive the point home the way like Mel Gibson's movie does. Like the scourging, in particular, where the soldiers are like laughing.
Yeah.
Like, hey, we're mutilating this guy, and it's a joke. Like, it's a joke to us.
You know, that scene. always been able to sign my name to it. Because my root sin is sensuality.
Mm.
It's taken on a new form now, and thanks be God, it's not as grave as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But as I look back, and I think back to my promiscuity in my high school and college days, especially when the flog is deep in his side,
Ooh,
and they
yeah.
rip it out.
Yeah. That one's tough.
I can sign my name to that.
Like that's you. That's your sin.
That's my sin.
Yeah.
But the beautiful thing, and we ought not to forget this, especially on Easter Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Mike, this is kind of a paraphrase of Father Mike's Palm Sunday homily from 2018. We can sign our name to it and say we did that to him,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be fully accurate. It is.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot open just one eye. The Holy Spirit opens both eyes. One to the horror and reality of sin,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one to abounding mercy.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to open, yes, Hudson, you did this to me, but Hudson, I endured this for you.
Mm-hmm. There is no greater love.
And I have to share a fruit from last night. I was at Vigil,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about Constellations earlier. I realized that the Lord said, Hudson, you're a source of great consolation for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just particular to me, it's for all of us. He truly, loves us. He honestly looks at us and loves us.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot forget that in this spiritual journey, this earthly pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sign our name to our sin, take the reality of sin seriously, but recall that the Lord's love for you is greater than his hatred of the sin.
Mm-hmm. I like this idea, and I think we're almost out of time. But thank you so much for being on this.
Thank you, Matthew.
Podcast, Hudson. Yeah,
Happy Easter, brother.
dude.
I
Happy
love
Easter,
you.
bro. Love you too.
And that concludes our very first episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to listen. Really appreciate it. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Send us some ideas, feedback, podcast topics that we could do in the future, people that we should have on the podcast. Open to all of it. You can do that via DM in the Catholic Group Me or via fraternusforge@gmail.com. And, as promised, here's a quick clip of Hudson and I impersonating two characters that you might know.
Give us a little bit of Jordan Peterson, Matthew.
You see, we're driving down the interstate, and the interstate was created in the early 20th century through a massive undertaking of the government. And they took responsibility, created a network. And now there are Marxists in place who think that network is part of the bourgeoisie. It's not good. They think Toyota Supras are a tool of the patriarchy. It's not good. It's going to go very wrong for you.
Life is hell. They're suffering. Yeah, I can never do Kermit. I could do Stitch, though.
Oh, really? Give us some Stitch.
Musa Manifesta.
There we go. There we go.
Hannah means family. Family means no one gets left behind.
Stitch.
Or forgotten.
Stitch, how was your Easter? Tell us about your Easter.
Oh. 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 Stitch. message. I can't get through it. So I think it's safe to say this is not going to be a Catholic-friendly podcast.
Well, this episode we'll put it in the vault. Won't ever see the light of day.
Oh.
Because we're slowing down. Anyway.